Good morning. I hope you can all hear me. Welcome to this second webinar on tomato brown rugose fruit virus hosted by AHDB. I'm Natalie Kaye. I'm Knowledge Exchange Manager for AHDB Horticulture. And alongside AHDB colleagues, including Nikki Harrison and Kim Parker, and Fera and Defra, and also industry representatives, I sit on a tomato brown rugose fruit virus steering group, which has the aim of forming a response to and mitigating for this virus from a UK perspective. Today, we're going to hear from, firstly, Adrian Fox. Oh, I think my presentation's not working, which is helpful. There we go. Who's going to talk about the latest practical recommendations coming out of the AHDB funded tomato brown rugose fruit virus survival and disinfection project. We'll then move on to Matthew Everett from Defra, who is going to talk about the current legislation relating to tomato brown rugose fruit virus in the UK, and also what to do in the situation of an outbreak. Thirdly, we'll move on to Dave Kaye from AHDAS, who's going to provide us with an overview of his fact-finding trip to Germany, the Netherlands and Israel, and also how they're managing the virus in these countries and whether there are lessons we can apply to UK production. So for information throughout the webinar, the audience is muted, but you can ask questions by submitting them through the questions box. There'll be opportunity to ask questions after each session and at the end of the webinar as well. Ideally, please indicate who the question is for if you have a preference. Any questions that we don't answer during the webinar will be saved, and where possible, these will be answered afterwards and added to the AHDB website. Similarly, after the webinar is over, if you have follow-up questions, please email them to me on natalie.key@ahdb.org.uk. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our web pages as well, so you'll be able to access the content after it's finished. During the webinar, if there are any problems which you can't highlight to me via the questions box, please also email me. Just quickly before we kick off, I wanted to highlight some of the resources we have available via the links on this slide. We have different information on the background of the virus, hygiene recommendations, risk assessments, updates from that survival and disinfection project, and symptom gallery for identification, as well as the previous webinar we held. And as I said, this webinar will also be made available. And we update these as and when we have more information. So let's kick off then I will pass over to Adrian. Hold on a second. Thank you, Adrian.
Okay, good morning. Good morning. My name is Adrian Fox from Fera Science Limited. I've been heading up some of the research work that's been looking at survival and disinfection of the virus. And I want to talk you through some of our results on that work, but I thought as I'm first up in the webinar, I would also do a quick reminder of what the virus is and how we've got here. So it's primarily a virus that affects tomatoes and peppers. And it's a member of the genus Tobamovirus, which are contact transmissible viruses. It really has come to the fore because it affects tomatoes that have the resistance genes that would normally make them resistant to Tobamoviruses, and this virus can overcome that resistance. So although the virus is called tomato brown rugose fruit virus, the thing you're most likely to see first would be leaf symptoms. And these can be very subtle or they can be more marked, but normally you'd see some kind of mottling and yellowing, as we've got on the side picture, or some rugosity in the leaf, and eventually yellowing and possibly wilting as well. What I would say is, as with most viruses, plants have got quite a limited range of reactions to virus, and this doesn't look too dissimilar from the effects you get with a lot of other tomato viruses. The virus itself is named after the brown rough patches that you would get on tomato fruit from infection. However, that's not a particularly typical symptom. It can happen, and the small patches, as we see on the left-hand photo here, shows some of that. But what would be more likely to happen is you'd get uneven ripening of fruit, and so you would get a mixture of unripened fruit and red fruit together. In pepper, you get some leaf symptoms, and again, you would get mottling of fruit, but more likely that you would see the leaf symptoms first. And again, in pepper, the varieties that have got the L resistance genes to ToBAMO viruses still look to be holding up against this virus, so it would be your susceptible varieties that would be particularly at risk. So the virus was first reported 2014, so just about 5-6 years ago in Israel, and was reported at that point to be spreading widely in Israel, but we'll hear more from Dave later in the webinar about the situation there. Shortly after, it was reported in Jordan, and then things went quiet for a few years, and then we got reports of the virus popping up in Germany, Italy. There were interceptions in California and in Mexico. And from Mexico, there were the multiple reports of on over 100 simultaneous outbreaks going on at once, and that's where we've got the first reports of pepper as well. However, we've more recently had reports of pepper from the Middle East, infected from the Middle East as well. This is what the picture looked at the end of 2019. So as you see, practically every tomato growing country in Europe has been affected, outbreaks in other US states, Mexico again, and we had an report of aubergine. However, this looks to be seed related, and we haven't yet, as far as I'm aware, had an outbreak in an aubergine crop. So primarily your risk is tomato, where the virus will overcome the resistance mechanisms in the tomato. However, it can go into pepper as well. In terms of hosts, as I've said, your major commercial hosts are tomato and pepper. And we have a seed report from aubergine. However, it's important to point out that we've got really limited information on non-cultivated hosts. And given the range of Nicotianas and wild solanums that have been reported with tomato brown rugose fruit virus, it's possible that it will go into other solanaceous species as well. So thinking about the work that we've been doing on survival and disinfection. So the virus comes from a genus called the ToBAMO viruses, and they're known to be robust. They're environmentally stable for extended periods of time outside their host. They remain infective at high temperatures. They can remain infective on seed for several seasons. And the two that we know most about are tobacco mosaic virus, which is the type member of the genus. And that there's a lovely report from the 1960s where they took the sputum from chronic smokers and showed that the virus was still infective in that sputum. The other probably widespread ToBAMO virus is pepper mild mottle virus, and if you've ever eaten chili sauce, you've probably already ingested this. No threat to human health, however, it has been investigated as an indicator of water treatment quality due to its prevalence and robustness. So that gives you an idea of how robust these viruses actually are. The problem is that there's no specific information for tomato brown rugose fruit virus, and given how recently it's emerged, we wanted to just make sure that some of the advice that we've been giving for control of ToBAMO viruses generally is still related to tomato brown rugose fruit virus, and it is valid advice. So the first question we had was to look at survival on skin and gloves, and we did this using both infected sap, where we rubbed infected sap on hands and on gloves, but we also used leaf contact, so simply touching an infected leaf. And in both situations, we had survival on skin and on gloves for at least 2 hours. So that's from both sap exposure and leaf contact. Your hands and gloves will remain infective in excess of 2 hours. And we stopped at 2 hours, not because the results weren't coming up positive, but we stopped at 2 hours because that's how long we ran the experiment for, and to go any longer than that would have been unkind on the staff that were doing the work, given they were walking around with hands that were covered in a highly infectious disease. So the question then is, how do we combat that on infected hands? And so we looked at the efficacy of hand washing. On skin, our initial work was looking at just a water wash, water with soap, water with a medicated hand wash, and water with a medicated hand wash and an alcohol type gel, which is all the kind of things you would put in a normal hand washing protocol. And that, quite frankly, didn't work. It was ineffective against the virus. So we then looked at different possible treatments, so 2 commercial treatments you can see there, and we looked at washing for 30 seconds and 60 seconds. And what I'd say is that the results so far show that there is inconclusive. They have some effect. The shorter washing, so in some situations those treatments have worked, and in other situations the virus has gone through the treatment and still passed on. However, at 60 seconds, what we have found is that the enzyme Rugose does look to be working at 60 seconds. However, that also raises questions about how easy it would be to police a 60-second hand wash and how practical that actually is in a glasshouse scenario. After we'd looked at survival on skin and gloves, the next question was to look at the survival on different glasshouse surfaces. In this situation, we took glass, which we used glass microscope slides, concrete, which you can see the kind of concrete bricks that we've used, aluminium, hard plastic, and for hard plastic we've used a packing crate, polythene, and stainless steel. And as you'll see, putting sap onto these surfaces, the virus remains infective in most situations for at least 4 weeks. After 4 weeks, you get some slightly more mixed results, but in some cases, the virus is still active after 3 months and up to 6 months. That work is still ongoing. We've got other treatments to look at in terms of the 6-month survivability, but the virus is certainly robust and will survive on most surfaces for over 3 months. So this then raised a question that, given how robust the virus is, how do you actually get rid of it? So one thing we wanted to look at was whether hot water treatment of picking crates would be effective in terms of removing the virus. And as I said, we know for viruses that they remain infective at high temperatures, and so we looked at a 5-minute hot water soak at 70 degrees and a 5-minute hot water soak at 90 degrees. So what the table here shows is that the pre-treatment was just checking that when we'd put infective sap onto the surface, it was still infective before we started the treatment. We then soaked for 5 minutes at the different temperatures, and as you can see, at 90 degrees we got the virus denatured, and that's been repeated, and that effect holds up. But at 70 degrees we didn't get effective control, but once we used Virkon, which is one of our disinfectants, we got control in both situations. So what we'd recommend is that if you can treat plastic crates at high temperatures in excess of 90 degrees for at least a short period of time, that will have some effect on the infectivity of the virus. We also wanted to look at the efficacy of different disinfectants. So we used all the same surfaces that we've used for the survival work, and initially we wanted to look at just short contact, because obviously within a working glasshouse scenario, the ability to be able to clean something down quickly is of paramount importance. And as you'll see here, in for the treatments we've currently tried, the 1 minute treatment is ineffective against the virus. The only one we've got some longer treatment results for at the moment is Virkon S, and that at 1 hour at 1% appears to be effective at controlling the virus. So we're now working onwards from there. We're looking at the broader range of products on the longer treatment times, and that's very much work in progress. And we'll be looking at that 60-minute contact time for those other products, and we'll also be repeating the Virkon S at 1 hour just to make sure that that holds up as a treatment. So from this work, we can look at the different possible routes of dissemination of the virus. And we know that contact, mechanical, pollination by bumblebees have all been demonstrated, at least experimentally, for brown rugose fruit virus. There's still the question about seed-borne contamination or true seed infection. We know that that holds up for other viruses and other contact-transmitted viruses, but it's yet to be demonstrated and reported for brown rugose fruit virus. Again, we know for other contact-transmitted viruses that irrigation water may also pose a risk, as may soil and compost. And we know that infected fruit going through pack houses will carry the virus, and you can pick up the infected virions on your fingers, and that again gives you a potential source for contamination. Again, similar with vegetable boxes, if you got contact with fruit or contact with fruit sap, that will again raise questions about the potential for contamination entering into a clean glasshouse. And we're also considering other routes such as non-seed products, processed foods and other vectors. And whilst these are considered to be potential risks for other contact transmitted viruses, it's key to point out that they've not yet been demonstrated for brown rugose fruit virus. So this really leaves us with only being able to recommend hygiene best practice at the moment, and supported by disinfectants, and hopefully as the work goes on we will find more useful disinfectant products and regimes that we can then add into this advice. But here's a picture of one of our inspectors from APHA, Marcus Lazenby, showing the kind of overshoes and protective clothing that we'd consider to be essential when moving into a glass house to avoid bringing contamination in, or once you're in there to stop spreading contamination around in the glass house. And so in terms of the current advice for hygiene best practice, given the somewhat mixed results we've had for hand washing, I think we have to say, please try and use disposable gloves, and you change them as often as necessary. And I appreciate that is a bit of a piece of string advice, because how often is as necessary, and that will come down to a risk assessment in every situation that you're in within your glass house. Use disposable clothes and overshoes. If you don't use disposable clothes and overshoes, then staff should wear clothing only used within that glass house, and then that should be regularly laundered at high temperatures to make sure that you haven't got carryover of virus. It's also worth considering implementing zonal working, and this would be something that we would really recommend in an outbreak situation to prevent moving infection further within the glasshouse. However, implementing it as a prophylactic measure may also give you good control and stop the virus spreading, because there will be a period between infection and seeing symptoms where you could be inadvertently spreading the virus around. And again, disinfection of equipment within the glasshouse, tools, and so hopefully the infection work we've done and the disinfection work we've done should help to formulate some disinfection protocols that can be of use to growers. You can also engineer to situations to limit exposure of your glasshouse, so we'd advise restricting access to the place of production and only allow people into your glasshouse that should be there. Don't have visitors, be very careful about who else comes in. And if you train those staff to recognise plant diseases and to follow best practice for a high health crop, again, those eyes and ears of your staff are one of your best defences against the virus coming in and it being seen quickly when it does arrive. As with zonal working, you should consider limiting movement of staff. So you shouldn't have staff moving from packing facilities into production facilities and vice versa. And ideally, and I appreciate this isn't possible in most situations, but if you can prohibit sorting and packing of produce on your sites, so you're not bringing fruit from off-site onto your site, then that will again limit the exposure to contamination coming onto your site. And similarly, if you prohibit consumption of susceptible hosts and only provide staff with fruit from your own production facility for them to eat while they're on site, and that will again prevent contamination that could inadvertently pass the virus into your crop. And something that I think people don't really think about, but the things that you have on you, and I think most people have a mobile phone on them at all times these days, but again, those can be sources of contamination that could harbour infection. So things like jewellery, watches, mobile phones, limit access of people taking them into the glasshouse, but also if people have them, try to limit them using them within the glasshouse. And so if mobile phones are to be brought on site, they should be placed in sealed plastic disinfected covers so that you know that there's no chance of contamination from that source into your crop. So in summary, the first outbreak of ToBRFV brown rugose fruit virus was recorded in 2014 and is now reported from at least 13 countries, and we have several more anecdotal reports that we still don't have confirmation of at the moment. So the virus is spreading rapidly. The virus is extremely robust and it can be transmitted mechanically and through contact. And at the moment, there is no currently available commercial germplasm, so there are no commercially available resistant varieties. Long distance movement is likely and through seed-borne infection, and even though you may get low seed infection rates, the risk of that seed becoming an infected plant, which then forms a source of inoculum for your crop, is quite high. But also remember, movement of the virus is possible through plant supplanting and infected fruit. And at the present time, we have limited options for mitigating against the virus, and that really falls down to diagnostic-led surveillance, making sure that seeds are tested, young plants are tested before you bring them on site, and also implementing good hygiene measures on your sites and within your crops. So finally, some acknowledgements, AHDB for funding the work and Defra for funding other work on tomato brown rugose fruit virus through our long-term service agreement. The Fera virology team, who sat around with virus on their hands for far too long, including Anna, Leanne and Stephen. The members of the Tomato Brown Rugose Fruit Virus Steering Group, the UK Tomatoes Grower Association, and Dr. Heiko Zeibel from Julius Kuhn in Germany, and the EPO panels for all the advice and information that they've provided on the virus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. That was really great to hear from you. Does anyone have any questions? If so, can they be submitted through the questions box on the little tab there? I've got one. Do you have a timeline for when other results will be achieved? For example, the disinfectants that are being tested.
Okay, that work is being done as we speak. So it will be over the next 3 months or so, those results will come out. Obviously, the 6-month survival will be slightly longer than that, but all that is ongoing work at the moment.
And what other products are being tested at the 1 hour contact time, other than the ones you mentioned?
Okay, so the ones we mentioned, and we're also at the moment looking at a glutaraldehyde product, but I would have to check specifically which one. We can get back to that in the Q&A answers.
Yeah, that's fine. Any further questions? Oh, here we go. What are the vectors of the virus?
So the vectors, it's not vectored in the traditional sense through insects. The vectors would be primarily contact transmission on humans. We know that bumblebees will transmit the virus through pollination activity, but again, that's picking up the virus and passing it on rather than true vector transmission. The major risks are really through seed transmission and through bringing in infected plants onto your sites.
Thank you. What was the contact time tested for Virkon after tray washing?
That was, I think, 5 minutes. But again, I'll have to double check, and we'll get that in the Q&A.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, I think that's it for questions at the moment. As I said, if there are questions that crop up throughout, please submit them via that box. Otherwise, we'll pass over to Matthew.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So as you've just heard from Adrian, tomato brown rugose fruit virus is a very significant pest with the potential for huge economic impact to our tomato and pepper industries. And yet, before November last year, there were very few measures in place to prevent the entry of the virus into the EU and to spread the virus within prevent the spread of the virus within the EU. So there were prohibitions on solanaceous plants for planting other than seed, which were prohibited from countries outside of Europe and the Mediterranean. But of course, the virus is present in parts of Europe and the Mediterranean. There are also no restrictions on the movement of seed, apart from that the seed must have been acid extracted or have undergone equivalent measures. And therefore, there was a huge drive to strengthen the EU measures. And following the presentation of an Italian pest risk assessment at the EU Standing Committee in June of last year, new EU measures were approved in the following month. And that is extremely speedy, particularly for the EU. And I think it's one of the quickest turnarounds of any pest that has gone through the Standing Committee. These EU measures apply to tomatoes, solanum, capsicum, anum, fruit, pepper, capsicum, anum, pepper. And during the transition period, the UK will be following these EU measures.
Excuse me, Matthew. Sorry.
So what I want to do in the rest of this presentation.
You're a bit echoey. I don't know whether because Adrian and I are in the same room, so perhaps Adrian could turn off the sound on his computer. That might help. Excuse our technical issues.
Yeah, the sound's been turned off, but yeah, I've still got this echo.
I think it's a little bit better. Try again.
Is that any better?
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Okay, great. Right. Okay. Right, so what I want to do in the rest of this presentation is to go through these new EU measures and then to finish off the presentation by going through what we would do in an outbreak situation. So first of all, what do the new EU require of the National Plant Protection Organization, the NPPO? And Defra represents the NPPO for the UK. So we would have to tomato and pepper plants for planting, either at the point of entry or at the place of destination when imported into the UK. We would have to carry out annual surveys for the virus, and this would at least include the visual inspections for the virus at an appropriate time in the season. And finally, we would have to inform any person who may have infected plants of the presence or suspected presence of the virus, the possible consequences and risks of having the virus, and the measures to be taken to prevent the establishment and spread of that virus. And as I said, I'll go through those at the end of the presentation. So perhaps more useful for all those on the call is what the EU measures require of industry, of the importer. So starting with seed, so if you want to bring tomato and pepper seeds into the EU, they must be by a sanitary certificate and fulfill one of the following requirements. So they must be from a country free of the virus, an area free of the virus, or they must have been officially sampled and tested for the virus. The measures are the same for movement within the EU, apart from instead of a phytosanitary certificate, they would move with a plant passport. And there is no country freedom option. And that's perhaps because the EU is treated as one single entity, one country, if you will. So looking at the measures in more detail, first looking at the pest-free areas, country freedom and area freedom. They must be established by the MPPO of the exporting country, and they must be in accordance with the relevant international standards of phytosanitary measures. And for country freedom, the international standards, all you have to show is that the country is there have been of the virus. And this would be done through general surveillance, such as looking through published scientific papers, industry reports, citizen science. But you wouldn't be actively surveying, specifically surveying for the, and it would just be using the information that is available. Whereas for area freedom, where you have a country where the virus is present, but you want to show an area within it is free of the virus, then you would have to be a little bit more rigorous. You would have to do specific surveillance for the virus. You'd have to establish measures to prevent the entry of the virus into that area. Moving on to the seed testing option. In the EU measures, it says that the seed must have undergone official testing for the virus on a representative sample using the appropriate methods. And then this raises the question of how much seed you should be testing. And really, if you want to be confident that your batch of seed is free of the virus, then you need to be testing in the region of 3,000 seeds. And this has been recommended by the International Seed Testing Association for testing of tobamoviruses. And it would give you a confidence level of about 95%, finding a 0.1% level of infection. Right, moving on to plants for planting other than seed. The measures are quite similar to seed. So if you want to move tomato and pepper plants for planting into the EU, they must come in with a phytosanitary certificate, and they can be from a country free of the virus or an area free of the virus, just seed. But different to seed, they can also originate a registered production sign to be free of the virus on the basis of inspection, and those plants must arrive from seeds that originate from an area free of the virus, or they have been officially sampled and tested negative for the virus. And the movement within the EU, the measures are the same, apart from instead of a phytosanitary certificate, you have a plant passport, and there is no country freedom option. So those are the measures to prevent the entry of the virus into the EU and into the UK, and to prevent it spreading within the EU. But what action would we take if there is an outbreak in the UK? And of course, there has been an outbreak in the UK in Kent in July last year. And the measures that were implemented during that outbreak will be likely be similar for any future outbreak of the virus. In accordance with the EU measures that I've just described, tomato brown rugose fruit virus is prohibited from being introduced and being spread within the EU, and therefore will be taking statutory action against findings of tomato brown rugose fruit virus. And the aim will be to contain the virus, but ideally to eradicate the virus. The action that we will take will be very much on a case-by-case basis, but as a guide, I will go through some of the likely measures that we will take in an outbreak situation. So in the growing season, when the virus is found, then we will be thinking about preventing the spread of the virus. So we will be restricting the movement of plants out of the affected glasshouse or glass houses, apart from if they are moved for destruction. And we may also allow the movement of fruit direct to retail or wholesale, and we may allow the fruit to be packed at another production site as long as there are sufficient hygiene measures in place to prevent the spread of the virus. We will also be thinking about the restriction of movement of people, equipment, machinery, vehicles, etc. into and out of the affected glasshouse. As Adrian was saying, the virus is very easily mechanically transmissible, so there is that potential for spread. If there are plants showing very severe symptoms of the virus, we may decide that we want to kill those plants to reduce the viral load of the virus in the affected glasshouse. We will also be thinking about good hygiene measures, as Adrian went through in his presentation. And if there are glasshouses grow host crops nearby to the affected glasshouse, then we would be thinking about monitoring the symptoms on those crops. And while bumblebees are usually the good guys, in this case they're a bit of a bane, and as they can also transmit the virus mechanically, and therefore we will be thinking about minimizing that risk of transmission. At the end of the season, we'll clean up, so we will need to remove all of the plant material from the house, and that will be destroyed either by deep burial or another approved method, depending on the situation. And we will need to remove any disposable items from the glass house, such as string and growing media, etc., from the glass house. One exception would be, of course, if the plant grew directly into the soil, not in pots, then it might not be possible to remove the growing media in that case. Once all the material has been removed from the glass house, we want to clean down the glass house with water and detergent to remove traces of organic matter. And then we will want to disinfect the glass house. It's really important that the organic matter is removed because disinfectants don't work as well if organic matter is present. We will also need to be thinking about preventing cell-sown tomato and pepper seed germination, which can act as a reservoir for the virus. Then be a host-free period, and the length of that free period will be dependent on the situation. And it is likely that we might want to take swabs of the affected glasshouse during that free period to show that the cleaning and disinfection has been effective and that the virus is not present. And after the new crop is planted, we will be inspecting that crop for symptoms of virus in spring. Likely in spring when the symptoms are more likely to be apparent. And hopefully then we will be able to declare eradication of the virus. And are developing a contingency plan for the virus, which goes through the whole outbreak management process for the virus. And hopefully it will be available in the months, publicly available on the Plant Health Information Portal. And finally, just for your awareness, the European and Mediterranean Plant Protection Organization, which is a regional plant protection organization, which provides recommendations on plant health issues to its member countries, which has about 52 member countries, including the this organization expert working group on the virus in November last year, where they produced risk analysis for the virus, and they made recommendations on phytosanitary measures and on outbreak measures. It's currently being read at the moment, so it's not publicly available, but this will be very useful for us when considering our own measures. And there will be an opportunity for us to consider our own measures as we have left the EU. Right, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Matt. I've just got a couple of questions that have come in for you at the moment.
Okay.
What changes, if any, are expected to the legislation with Brexit?
So there is no change to the EU measures at the moment. We will be following these EU measures during the transition period to December, and we would be transposing those EU measures into our own legislation at the end of the transition period. But as I said, with the work that EPO has done and the monitoring of the situation that the UK is doing, we are considering our measures and whether we want to strengthen measures.
Okay, thank you. Another question. How should organic matter be disposed of? Should it be composted, or infected organic matter? Should it be composted or burnt?
Yeah, so as I said, so the main two options for the disposal of material would be incineration or deep burial of that material. But it may be possible that yes, that maybe anaerobic digestion or composting are possible options, but we would have to review those options, and we'd have to check what is being done through those measures. It would have to be very much done on a case-by-case basis. But we would be open to considering other measures if it's.
Okay, thank you. I think those are all the questions for you at the moment. So we'll pass over now to Dave. Thank you, Matt.
Okay. Right, hopefully you can all see this. Good morning, everyone. My name's Dave Kaye. I'm a plant pathologist for RSK-ADAS, and I'm going to talk to you today about the tomato brown rugose fruit virus fact-finding trips to Israel and Europe, which I undertook last year. So obviously there's great concern surrounding tomato brown rugose fruit virus, and it was decided last year that it would be worth a researcher undertaking a fact-finding study tour of tomato and pepper production sites and research institutes in the Netherlands, Germany and Israel, where the virus has been found, reported and acted on, with the aims to identify management strategies for the avoidance of infections occurring on site, and then improving strategies for reducing this impact when infections have occurred, and also how these infections can be successfully eradicated from sites. One of the most sensible things that we did, or the industry did, and the industry in Europe did, when the threat became larger, was to stop visits. It's a sensible, pragmatic approach, but when you stop visits, you can restrict communication. And when you've got a new outbreak such as this, or the emergence of a new virus, it's important to keep communication levels high. So it was hoped that if someone such as myself went out to speak to people directly, that would facilitate open and honest discussions to make sure we got as much useful information available as possible for not just for UK industry, but for all. So I ended up on 2 trips, one to Germany and the Netherlands and one to Israel. And you can see just maps, and the green pins show the stops I went to. I visited all aspects of the of tomato production, so seed breeders and producers, propagators, growers, extension workers and phytopathologists, and several diagnostic laboratories and researchers. So Nacktown-Bau, the German Chamber of Agriculture for the North Rhine-Westphalia region, the Julius Kühn Institute and the Volcani Center. Shortly before my first trip, which was to Europe in, I think it was October, was the first official outbreak of the virus in the Netherlands. So I wasn't able to visit any growers in the Netherlands during that trip, but I did visit one of the German growers who suffered the infection in 2018 and met with 3 growers in the southwest of Israel who also had the infection. I was due to go back and visit some pepper growers in Israel, but due to escalating political tensions in Israel, it was unsafe to do so. So unfortunately, I didn't visit any pepper growers. So rather than talk about each what I learned from each country individually, I thought I would go through the 3 stages of production. So from seed production, propagation and main crop growing, and then raise any interesting points that I learned along the way. A lot of what I've got to say today will be similar to what we've heard already from Adrian and Matt, because they're common sense practices. So it's good to see in a way that a lot of what everyone's already doing is already good practice. So as Adrian said, the virus is already present on the seed coat. Is only present on the seed coat. We're not seeing it in the endosperm of the seed, which makes controlling it much easier, because if there are infected seed, it can be successfully eradicated or deactivated on the surface of the seed, which makes controlling it more easy. As Adrian said, the rate of transmission from infected seed is likely to be very low and probably won't be considered one of the main transmission routes, although it is possible probably. This is actually under investigation, so I visited Aviv Dombrovsky at the Volcani Institute in Israel, and they've taken seed from infected fruit, and then they've planted that in sterile soil, and then they're just letting that grow. They're not interfering with it, so they're not touching it, so there's no risk of contamination, and they're letting it grow, and then at a certain stage they're testing it using the ELISA method to see whether it's infected. And when I spoke to Aviv in November, they tested over 1,100 plants, which from infected seed, and not a single one of them had demonstrated infection. So it will be possible, but it appears that the rate of transmission from inoculum on the seed coat to seeds is incredibly low. And then if you think about that, producers will be treating their seeds anyway. Seed transmission is not going to be a major route. It's always most likely going to be a mechanical transmission, which is how in Israel it spread so quickly in just a year, basically across the whole country. Generally speaking, seed production is isolated for good reason. Keep it isolated so your risks are low. There are some cases where it started off being isolated, but other sites have grown up around some tomato seed production sites. And I have heard of one producer that's actually up and moved because of this. So, you know, they are taking it very seriously, the threat of this virus. Access to parent stock is very limited. Obviously, it was limited before, but they've put in further protections. These crops are closely monitored by phytopathologists and tested for tobamoviruses. A lot of the tests just detect tobamoviruses. They can't distinguish between tomato brown rugose fruit virus or tobacco or tomato mosaic virus. But that's not too much of a concern, because they don't want any of these viruses to be present. So they test routinely for these. But most seed producers will be following these quality assurance programs such as ISTA, ISHI, NAL, GSPP, or SCAL practices. So, you know, there's protocols for these, they're audited, so you can be confident that what they're doing is sufficient. And when I spoke to some of these seed producers, they said, we already have programs which are effective against tobamoviruses. Although this is a new virus, tomato brown rugose fruit virus, it's still a tobamovirus. So what they were doing before was already sufficient. But because of the threat, they have factored in a few changes to their practice. But on the whole, they were probably already sufficiently good at controlling it. Moving on to resistance breeding, as we know, there's no fully or partially resistant commercial varieties available. If there were, we of course would be using them. But resistance development is underway. With modern techniques that we've got now, it's probably occurring at an even faster rate than it would have done 5-10 years ago, but it's not going to be an immediate fix. It's going to take a few years for them to be developed. But it's such a concern that you can be confident that all the seed producers are going to be focusing a lot of their efforts on developing resistance to the virus. A resistant rootstock has been developed by the Volcani Centre. Remember, if you saw, we're at the Tomato Growers Conference in July last year, or September, Aviv Dombrowski spoke and he explained that in Israel they grow in the soil. They repeat grow year on year in the soil, and you can have infested material in that soil which can lead to infections from young plants which are planted. So a resistant rootstock has a real benefit in somewhere like Israel, but may not be that useful in more Western Europe growing ways. And also, rootstock is good, but you can still get mechanical transmission from the grafted variety by touch or however. So although it will delay symptoms, it's unlikely to stop them from occurring at all on the plant if there's a high viral load present. When I was in Israel, I also met with a second breeder, and they explained that they considered they may have found a second source of resistance. This is being investigated. They're trialing it this year on grower sites. Hopefully this is the case, but it's still early days and they'll be testing that over the next few years. But you know, I had limited time in Israel. I met with as many people as I could, but it's really promising to see with just a few people that I did meet that a lot of work's being done on resistance and they are getting somewhere. So hopefully there will be resistance coming through in the not too distant future. But then that also needs to be bred into the commercial varieties we use. Just to note that varieties asymptomatic to tomato brown rugose fruit virus do exist. These aren't resistant, so these will still have the virus and they can act as reservoirs for future infections. Because they've switched to two crop cycles a year now in Israel, there's probably a yield penalty of having an asymptomatic variety. So they wouldn't necessarily be something that you would consider growing as an option, because you would risk spreading these infection if you had it unknowingly from these varieties to susceptible varieties on your site. But there is varietal differences being seen, but we just don't know much about European varieties and how they respond to the virus at this point. Moving on to propagation. So propagators take it incredibly seriously. I met with a large group of propagators in the Netherlands and also with two of the largest propagators in Israel. And they all have the same message: avoidance is key. They supply a large amount of the industries, so there's a lot of risk involved with propagation. But yes, similar to the seed producers, a lot of these will follow GSPP or ISTA or ISHI guidance, and they will always request seed certificates and keep records. One of the problems is with this virus, especially in Israel, is that if an infection occurred very early on, it's unlikely symptoms will be seen before that plant is shipped off to a grower site. So if the propagators are confident with their practices, then they need to make sure that those seeds are cleaned sufficiently, and seed certificates are the only way of confirming that. But they have updated their site hygiene measures and propagators as new information emerges, and they continue to do so as we gather more information and share more information. Access to sites is very restricted. When I visited the propagator in Holland, I was asked to arrive first thing in the morning to ensure I hadn't been to any other sites. I went through one of these hygiene locks you can see in the image there. And that's not just a good physical machine to clean your hands and feet, but it's also like a physical visual reminder of the importance of hygiene. And these are the entrance and exit to all sites of this propagation business. When I entered the site, I was marched directly up to the meeting room. We had the meeting and I was marched back down. There was no tour. I wasn't invited to see the rest of the site, which was appropriate considering the risk. When they have contractors in who have to do some work, they are expected to just go where they're needed to work. They get changed into cotton oversuits and gloves and appropriate clothing in their vehicles, and they do not get unchanged or changed out of that until they're back in their vehicle when they've finished. They're expected to arrive in clean clothing, and clean clothing is supplied to staff when they arrive to work, so they change again. Grafting blades are very frequently changed. Gloves are worn at all times, gloves are changed, gloves are sterilized using appropriate disinfectants. And they've invested in single-use trays, so they're no longer happy to have trays back. So when anything's shipped out, the lorries are disinfected before anything's put in, and those trays will never return. They have cleaning machines for their trolleys, and always make sure that effective disinfectants are used at appropriate rates for sufficient time. So it's being taken very seriously at Propagation, and I was pleased to see the level that was being done. As Adrian mentioned, they are doing zonal working as well, and they've moved a lot of their tomato production to a few sites, and pepper production, just so that they can have additional practices and procedures at those sites, which they couldn't necessarily implement across all of their production, because they don't just grow tomatoes and peppers. Moving on to main crop production, as Adrian said, it's worth testing plants before or at delivery for the virus. Obviously, if you've got any suspicions or some plants are looking a bit strange, you might want to quarantine them when they arrive on your site, but it's worth establishing, if you do get an infection, where that infection came from. Again, visitors are limited and control access to production sites is managed. I've not been to many tomato nurseries in the UK in the last year because of the shutdown, and that's, I think, going to have had a real big impact on controlling the virus, because if you look at Israel and how quickly it spread there, it really does help to control who's coming in and into your site. It's important to monitor closely for symptoms. This is a message I kept on receiving whilst I was away, especially among rows. So I was very lucky to go to one of the German growers who suffered from the virus back in 2018. There were 6 German growers who had the virus, all part of a grower group. So unfortunately, it was spread via mechanical transmission between sites by visits. I met there with the grower, but also with a crop protection worker called Heike Scholz-Doblin, who was fantastic help. She really knows her stuff, has been a consultant on tomatoes for several years, and she noticed a pattern in the spread of the disease. So she's aware of the epidemiology, and she's aware of the pattern of the disease, and it's important that we understand diseases well in order to control them. So she noticed along the first row into the glasshouse that symptoms had appeared all along the row. And often if it was a disease such as Pepino, it tends to be quite sporadically spread. So she thought something was up, and she sent some of those plants off for testing. And whilst they were being tested, the situation became much worse along those rows. Symptoms really progressed quickly. And it was later identified, firstly as the Tobamo virus and later as tomato brown rugose fruit virus. She did this with the help of the Julius Kühn Institute and the Chamber of Agriculture in Germany, but also she contacted the Volcani Center, and between them they came up with a hygiene protocol, which actually led to the successful eradication of tomato brown rugose fruit virus from all 6 sites in 2018. So you don't want it on your site, but if you do get it, if you are sensible and you do a comprehensive cleanup in a protected setting, it is possible to eliminate the virus, and we've eliminated it from the UK as well. So that's a really positive outcome, I suppose, of a negative thing that happened. On this site now, they have changed how they act. So they wear fresh clothing, and they more frequently replace their gloves, and they disinfect their hands once they've got the gloves on using EnoRapid on site. They've now implemented a 1 knife per row method. So basically, in order to not use the same blades on across the whole cropping area, every evening all the blades are collected and they're soaked overnight in a suitable disinfectant. These are then hung out first thing in the morning after, say, 12 hours of disinfection, so they can be confident that these knives are disinfected. And then the crop workers will work down a row, pick up that knife whilst wearing gloves, work down the row, and when they finish the row, they come back, hang the knife up, maybe change their gloves or re-disinfect their gloves, and then they start working on to the next row. And the idea is that this will prevent the spread from row to row if there is inoculum present. The Netherlands, I spoke to another consultant in the Netherlands, and they have a similar system, but they just use 2 knives. So when a trolley is going down a row, somebody's working with a clean disinfected knife, they're working along the row, and whilst they're going down, another blade is soaking in suitable disinfectant. And by the time they've reached the end of the first row, they can then put that blade into the disinfectant, get the other blade out, which hopefully has had sufficient time to be disinfected. That's something worth investigating to make sure that that is sufficient time. And then they'll disinfect their gloves and start working back the other row. So it's a similar technique that's been identified by growers in Germany and Netherlands and is being used. Just a reminder, if you do have any suspected areas which you're concerned about, please do quarantine them as soon as possible. When you're quarantining anything, consider closing hives until testing is complete. As Matt said, and Adrian actually, bees have been implicated as transmitters of the virus, but they're not going to be a major problem, because if there's already in order for them to spread the virus, there already has to be a high enough level of inoculum on the site for them to encounter. So it's worth closing the hives as a precaution to stop maybe further spread, but bees aren't going to be your main risk. The German growers that I visited grow in boxes, and they have coir in there which they just top up each year after they've removed the plants. If you've got suspected infection or you're concerned, make sure that you replace your growing media each year. Be careful with how you replace this. Don't just dump it outside the site. If it does contain tomato brown rugose fruit virus particles and it's outside your site for a long time, dust from that, if it was coir, could blow off into your other houses which may not be infected, or it could actually infect weed species around your site, and you don't want to establish a permanent presence of the virus on wild species on your sites. So dispose of your growing media and any infected plants carefully, and as Matthew said, whether that's incineration, deep burial, or composting will depend on the recommendations that Defra produce. But in Germany, they incinerate everything because they want to be confident they've got rid of it. In the Netherlands, I believe they compost or will compost, but that has to be done at a certified composting facility where they can be confident that sufficient duration of time and sufficient temperatures have been achieved to make sure that all virus is deactivated. At clean down, it's important to ensure that your contractors and equipment and their equipment is all clean. Discussions in the Netherlands and Germany, people said that some contractors will visit several sites in one day. So unless they're cleaning their equipment well, if they encounter a infected site in the morning, there's a good risk they're going to spread that between sites. So make sure that anyone you have on is always clean and their equipment is clean. They wear protective clothing and everything's disinfected before you let anything on site. Perhaps ask them where they've been so you know your risks. And then just use disinfectants known to work against the virus at their maximum rates and for appropriate durations to maximize their effectiveness. Make sure you use it as effectively as well. So if it says to spray on or apply as a foam, do your research into what's best, and we can look at the results from Fera as well for guidance on that. Moving on to Israel. So although Israel grow very differently to us, there is still lessons that we can learn from them. They grow pretty much all their tomatoes in one region, the West Negev region in the southwest of Israel. It's a very arid region. They repeat crop over and over again, often with very short breaks. Occasionally they're solarized, but on the whole they won't. No other crops in there. So it's really intensive tomato production, always in the soil, almost always in the soil. So because of this, the inoculum level has built up over the last 4 or 5 years, and they just have to live with it. So in order to maximize yields, but they can't get rid of the virus, everything is delay based. It's not going to be avoidance based like it is in Europe. And this has given them some insights which are useful. Generally speaking, their site hygiene is very poor compared to ours or compared to Europe. And as I said, the soil is infested with plant debris containing the virus, and there's weed species which are present in the house which will also exhibit symptoms. So again, we don't tend to have weed species or many weed issues in the West, but and they do, and that is a concern. So they switched to 2 cropping cycles per year because plants weren't surviving for a whole season, and by doing 2 cropping cycles a year and grafting, which they didn't do before, and taking 2 heads, they've managed to go, and also from an improved choice of variety to ones which aren't so susceptible, they've managed to reduce their crop losses from about 100% to around 20, which isn't good, isn't ideal, but they can survive on that. They're all in the same boat, and they can just keep going until resistance is developed. One of the major recurring points, I suppose, of the trip was that symptom severity has been linked to plant stress. In Israel, they have 2 cropping cycles a year, one in the winter, a longer period, and then a shorter one in the summer. In the summer, the symptoms tend to be much worse because of the high heat. I spoke to a breeder who has sites in Turkey where they can actually grow tomatoes at incredibly cold temperatures during the winter months, down as low as 4 degrees. But the cold temperatures, the shock of that, actually brings out more severe symptoms there. So heat or cold. In Holland and Germany, we saw a lot of symptoms coming through towards the end of the year, into the growing season, and that might be down to shorter day lengths, which might stress the plants. And also in Israel, because they're in the semi-desert West Negev region, occasionally they have to irrigate with desalinated water. And that means that desalinated water often has a low magnesium level. So they get deficiencies in the plants. And the plants which are showing deficiencies not only obviously have a change in their growth characteristics, but they are more highly susceptible to symptoms developing. So maximize focus on your plant health, as well as avoiding any undue stress. Obviously, picking and growing generatively can be stressful to the plants, but try and avoid any unnecessary stress if possible. Just a few images now. So this is a standard Israeli production site in that region of Israel from November. You can see it's just grown directly into the soil. Easily, I mean, you could, when I was walking along here, you were easily catching some soil. It wasn't level, you were kicking it up without meaning to, and that could hit the plants. And if that's got viral particles, you could infect them. There was no disinfectants available. These are all net houses, by the way. No disinfectants available at the door. We bought our own cotton oversuits and everything with us. But yes, it's not very clear from this picture, but this crop isn't that old, but you're already seeing symptoms. And there were weeds around, but I don't think you can see any weeds in that picture. But here is a weed. So this weed species, weed species do act as a source of infection in Israel. So I'm not sure what this weed is, but you can see symptoms of the virus already. So some growers do mulch, but you need to make sure that we're aware of weed species which may act as a host. In Israel, they're looking at this right now, the Volcani Centre again, but we don't know much about what can be hosts in the UK, but it'll most likely be the solanaceous weeds, which hopefully you'll be keeping low around production sites anyway. Not all sites are the same, and I visited a site with high hygiene standards when I was in Israel, and the differences were like chalk and cheese, to be honest. Where somebody growing like this might only get about 6 to 8 trusses from one of their crops. This grower can get up to 10 or even 12. But it underlies the importance of hygiene. As a plant pathologist, I always go on about hygiene, but it really does make a difference to what you can achieve. And it does make a big difference to this grower. So they've covered the floor in MyPacks to reduce, obviously, access to the soil and being kicked up with virus particles. They grow in grow bags in coir slabs, which is different to most of the growers over there. And they use fresh clothing and gloves. So again, gloves are worn by everyone at all times and changed frequently. And they actually get given boiler suits with a different number of the day on it. So there's 1 to 6, Sunday to Friday, and each day the crop workers wear a different number so that it's clear that nothing's been worn from the day before. And clothing throughout, whether it was Germany, Israel, or the Netherlands, is seen as a key way of controlling the disease. This site used disinfectants. There were foot dips and there were hand disinfectants as well. And they limit access to the sites for staff and machinery and equipment, and it makes a massive difference. They also train their staff, and that is another thing that people raised. Make sure that your staff and not just your higher staff, make sure everyone's aware of what the symptoms look like, because when they come in, they can spread quite rapidly, so you need to get on it as soon as possible. In Israel, all the staff, crop workers are pretty much from Thailand, and the Israelis obviously speak Hebrew, so there are language barriers, but this grower gets in translators more frequently to make sure they can effectively communicate with their staff. And they also monitor them. So they use this monitoring software, which is called the pickup barcode system. And so the crop workers scan to say when they finished a row. This allows the grower to receive direct updates on how efficient things are going, the efficiency of the workers, but also if there's issues, these can then be traced back and to the individual staff members. And then if you can trace where those staff members have been, if you're worried that the virus is spreading, if they're spreading the virus. It's also in Hebrew for the grower, but the workers receive it in Thai, so it's another way of communicating. But monitoring seems to be something that they're quite interested in for disease management. And actually, if you're worried that you're being watched, you tend to make sure that you're a bit more efficient in what you do anyway. After, you can see from this picture how close these net houses are together. The two I visited, which I've shown you pictures from, they were about 15 meters apart. This is all the growing media that's just been dumped outside the site from that one, the clean house we just showed photos of. You can see that if it's a blustery, windy day, particles could blow out into your neighbour's net houses, infecting that. And also, yeah, it's just potentially acting as an inoculum source. So please don't, store things like that on your sites for too long. That's probably being quite effectively solarized, which isn't an option we'll have in the UK, and that will end up just going to pineapple production. So there's probably quite a tomato brown rugose fruit virus inoculum load wherever they grow pineapples in Israel as well now. So in conclusion, I haven't been able to cover everything today. It's been quite a quick description of some of the main points. If you want more information, please go onto the AHDB website. Before Christmas, I released a summary, I suppose, of what I've learned, including things I haven't talked about today. You can see, if you go onto the AHDB website, you'll find that. But if you can't find it for any reason, just Google my name, Dave Kaye, and then best practice for tomato brown rugose fruit virus findings from Europe and Israel, and you'll find it. So there's more information there, but the report will be released soon. But breeding is in development for resistance. It's only a matter of time, but for now, just really focus on avoidance. And if you do have an outbreak, make sure that you get on it as quick as possible and follow sensible rules to make sure that we can eradicate it from your site. Review all your practices, and it's important to make a site-specific plan for you. So look at what we've got, but make it specific for your site. Limit all access if possible, and just let people and equipment where they need to be, and consider zonal working. Train all staff, no matter who they are, on the symptoms, because that could be a real benefit, and just keep on monitoring crops and consider monitoring your staff. We're learning more about disinfectants with the work from Fera, so make sure that you use disinfectants which are effective at maximum rates and for sufficient time to achieve effective control. And if you can, avoid unnecessary plant stress and just focus on maximizing plant health as well. But if you do have an outbreak, make sure that you report it to Defra as soon as possible. Yeah, I've got a lot of people to acknowledge for chips. Wouldn't have been possible without the help of a huge amount of people. Basically, the entire tomato industry, I think I contacted at some point, so thank you for them, and the AHDB for funding it, of course, and the steering group. Tim O'Neill for his contacts, former ADAS plant pathologist. Heike Schultz-Doblin, who was fantastic help. She was the extension worker in Germany. Joey Kelman, who provided fantastic support to me in Israel. I'm very grateful for that. The sites I visited that I can name: Nacktownbau, the German Chamber of Agriculture, Grown Agro Control, Heiko at the Julius Kuhn Institute, Aviv at the Volcani Center, and all individuals visited, and those who couldn't be visited but were happy to supply me with information and supported the project. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Dave. That was really interesting and comprehensive, so that's great. Got a couple of questions. I think some of them will also probably extend out to Adrian and Matt, but one initially, did you, from what you've seen, did you have any recommendations for organic production?
This was a tricky one. I asked everyone I visited because it's such a concern, and unfortunately, apart from just do your very best to stay clean and not let it on your site, there weren't any practical outcomes for organic production. I'm afraid not.
Okay, That's fine. There's a question here that you might be able to help with, and maybe Adrian. Will sodium hypochlorite in a wheel dip at 1000 ppm of active chlorine have any effect in stopping virus on forklift wheels entering the glasshouse from the pack house?
I think that's best for Adrian, but you'll need to make sure that you cover your entire wheel, so the whole wheel's covered.
Yeah, thanks for passing that one on, Dave. I think what I'd say is that so far the disinfectants we've tried at short exposure times appear to be relatively ineffective. Over and above that, there's the question mark of the practicalities of being able to disinfect a wheel within a rotation, which you're going to be sub 1 minute in terms of actual exposure. You're going to have the issues of how you clean it down. And then obviously as the wheels are spinning, it's going to push that disinfectant back off. There's a lot of crevices on a wheel as well. So looking at tyres is something we would like to do. And at the moment, we're just trying to work out the practicalities of how we do that within disinfection. So I think it's a don't really know is the ultimate answer.
Have there been any reported updates to outbreaks this year? Adrian, do you have any updates on that side?
The latest we've had is the outbreak in Spain. In terms of Europe, further afield, I'm not aware of any further outbreaks reported, but certainly for Europe, given the season, it's fairly early on in terms of the Northern European season, so time will tell. But as I said, the latest we have is the information on outbreaks in Spain.
And with that in mind, going back to your presentation, Adrian, with the outbreaks in Spain and the Netherlands that are currently under eradication, do we have any insight to what stage they're at with that currently?
Obviously, things are moving quite quickly. I think in both Spain and the Netherlands, the information we get is that when outbreaks in individual houses are found, they are under eradication. But to formally say that something is eradicated, you have to go through a full cropping cycle after your cleanup to show that you've got no carryover of the disease. So early days for some of those outbreaks, as I say, in both those countries, as far as I'm aware, the situation is moving. And as things are being found, action is being taken.
Thank you. I think this has been mentioned, but there's a question about how to minimize transmission by bumblebees. Are you happy to take that, Dave?
Yeah, so if you're worried about bumblebees transmitting, I would suggest you close down your hives first just to confirm whether you got the infection. And then I think I've heard of some screens being that very fine mesh being put over windows, whether or not that will stop them from being able to spread between sites. But I think if you've got it in a compartment, you're not going to realistically be able to stop spread of bumblebees in one compartment. But yeah, if you can limit the spread of them using mesh or whatever, or making sure that your doors are closed if you're going between compartments. I mean, some of them might fly out. But yeah, it's very difficult to control.
Thank you. In your opinion, well, Adrian or Dave, what further work in terms of research needs to be done, or what can we do in this country to protect ourselves, research-wise? So it's an open question.
I think it'd be to protect us would be just making sure that we continue to test, and maybe I think Adrian, you're already coming up with protocols for kind of a gold standard for testing, which a lot of people were asking me when I was away. but just improve testing and maybe know more from basically what we're doing, but maybe weed species would be useful to know what could potentially act as hosts, but just sensible approaches like that.
Yeah, as Dave says, I think knowing more about the alternate hosts, because again, that picture from Israel looks like Chenopodiaceae, and whether that's been reported or not as a host or not. As I said on my slides, and as Dave said, there's a potential range of other weed hosts that we don't yet know are hosts. So I think clarifying some of that will be useful. Obviously, getting some firmer disinfection advice would be useful. The ideal would be the shortest contact time possible, but we appreciate that that's probably not going to happen with this virus. And again, that then brings in things like what you might call the more awkward surfaces. It's one thing if you've got concrete that sits still and doesn't move, so you can treat it for a long period of time. But yeah, as we've already said, things like wheels on forklifts will present a real challenge, where you've basically got the space of time it takes to go through a wheel dip to try and disinfect that surface. I think on the diagnostic front, again, as Dave says, we're in the process of pulling together the diagnostic standard on tomato brown rugose fruit virus for the European and Mediterranean Plant Protection Organization, EPO. And that expert working group will kick off in the near future, and that will be pulled together as quickly as we can. But there are also some deeper questions, so that will cover the basics of diagnostics. So how reliable is it for diagnosing from seed? What are the best protocols to follow? How reliable is diagnosing from leaf, and what are the best protocols to follow? But some of the practical questions on the ground. So how early in the infection cycle can we actually pick up the virus, so that we can be sure that if we're doing latent testing, so testing of plants early in the cycle, that we can be sure when we're not seeing symptoms that we're still able to detect the virus, so we can then advise growers better on when the best time to test is, how many samples should be tested, and all of that is, at the moment, we're working on the best information we've got, but we don't have any hard and fast details to cover brown rugose fruit virus specifically.
I'll just add that obviously there's a lot of work being done on resistance, which we're not doing, but there's probably those better able to do it. So there obviously is research going on into that, a lot of research going on into that. So hopefully that'll come out not in the too distant future.
Thank you. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Do we have any idea of what the reported crop losses have been in Europe, Middle East and North America? So obviously you mentioned initially the losses in Israel, Dave, which they've managed to reduce considerably. Do we have any idea about elsewhere?
I think the original outbreak in the Netherlands, did they report 8? Because it was just starting, but that's the only one I know about. I know in pepper, because they don't have VL gene, VL4 gene resistance, in pepper, it's been quite catastrophic in Mexico. But from tomato, I don't know the figure, sorry.
I think one of the difficulties of getting that kind of information is differentiating between crop loss due to disease and crop loss due to eradication action. And in most situations in Europe, certainly because eradication action has been taken, the impact will effectively be total crop loss in most cases. But because we're not letting the crops run, it's difficult to say what the impact of that virus would be under Northern European conditions if you let the virus run its course.
Okay, thank you. I think this question says, how does LED diagnostic work, or LED diagnostic work? Does that question make sense to you?
LED, yeah, so does it mean LFD, perhaps? Lateral flow device diagnostics?
I imagine it would be.
Yeah.
That's LED, perhaps.
Sorry?
The question says LED, but I think maybe
Okay.
you're right.
I think if it's LFD, that would be lateral flow device type diagnostics, which essentially are an anti-sera based diagnostic that works in a similar way to an ELISA test, where you have an antibody that's specific to the virus that's coating, in the case of an LFD, a membrane, and it works in the same way as a pregnancy testing kit would work, that you would drip sap in a buffer onto the membrane, it would work its way up the membrane, and you would see a line go darker if the virus was present. At present, I'm not aware of any specific LFD type diagnostics for brown rugose fruit virus. What I would say is we know that some of the Tabamo virus anti-sera cross-react with brown rugose fruit virus, but whether any of the diagnostic manufacturers are either using that and claiming that you can pick up brown rugose fruit virus with their general Tabamo virus, so TMV or TOMV, LFD type kits, so you've got dipsticks, which are very similar. I'm not sure if anyone's claiming that, or whether there's a specific product available at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any indication of what the possibility is of varieties becoming naturally immune to the virus?
I wouldn't have thought that would be, of the way they're bred, I think they're quite uniform, so I wouldn't imagine there would be any natural immunity that would come in. I think that the breeding programs to develop resistance and then breed those resistance genes into existing varieties will be the most sensible approach. Trying to grow through the virus is not something I would necessarily advise, because if you've just got one site, if you've got multiple houses, you could spread it very easily between houses. And the longer you have that virus on site, the more difficult it is going to be to eradicate.
Thank you. Anything to add to that, Adrian?
Again, given the way that monoculture cropping works, you won't get plant immunity developing within crop. As Dave said, we're aware that resistance breeding work is ongoing, and no doubt resistance genes will be found, or alternatively tolerance may be found, but at present those aren't at market yet.
Okay, thank you. And one last question, which is, I think, quite tricky to answer. What is the likely level of infection on fruit in supermarkets? It must be impossible to answer, really, but any insight? They
found fruit, I think, in Florida, which came from Mexico, I believe, which may have been infected. But if it's infected, if it's fruit from infected plants, then and that's going through the packaging and the process, then it would stand to reason that you would pick up infected fruit in supermarkets. But I don't think any research has been done yet looking into whether there are infected fruit in the UK supermarkets.
No. Again, is there something Matt can pick up here? We certainly haven't looked specifically at fruit. And again, there's a chance that because of the variability in symptoms, that if fruit was coming from an infected house, that it could sneak through the system and make it through grading. But again, I'm not aware of any specific work that's ongoing. Matt?
There are some varieties in Israel which the major symptoms were seen definitely on the leaves, which meant that the plants didn't produce fruit for very long at all, but those fruits didn't necessarily have much in the way of symptoms on at all, so they could very easily get through.
Getting loads of feedback. Sorry, Matt's struggling to communicate at the moment. He's just getting some feedback.
Okay. Anything you can feed via you?
Yeah, because
or come round. Yeah.
We're actually sitting at the opposite end of the table, so if Matt comes around the table, he can we'll just talk on mic. Keep it simple solutions. Okay, grab the chair. Do you need your piece of paper?
I'm okay. Yeah, so the question was about the level of incidence in fruit. So all I can really add to this is that the European and Mediterranean Plant Protection Organization, when they held their expert working group in November last year, they have pointed out that fruit is a potential pathway, particularly damaged fruit. There is the possibility of transfer of the virus from damaged fruit onto other materials and growing crops, but really we don't have any indication of what level of incidence that would be, and then moving forward to a supermarket.
Thank you very much, Matt. I think with that, I just want to finish up and say thank you very much to Dave, Matt and Adrian for their contributions. I think you'll agree it's been really comprehensive. As mentioned previously, if there are further questions, please do send them to my email address, so natalie.key@ahdb.org.uk, and then between us we'll make an effort to answer those and put them up as a Q&A on the website alongside this recorded webinar as well, hopefully within the next couple of weeks. So with that, thank you for your attention, and no doubt we'll be in touch soon. Okay, thank you, bye.